I have a very mixed background. So on the one hand, I work as a digital artist working in the video games industry, and on the other, as a classical artist working sort of with oil paints and drawing. And for a long time, I kept these two disciplines very separate from each other because on the surface, they're seemingly very different. But fundamentally, when we look at the mediums upon which these artworks are created, we find that they're all static, they're all lifeless. And so it's the job of an artist working in whichever discipline to create this illusion of life and the illusion of depth and to sort of affect the viewer emotionally. And one of the most powerful techniques that the old masters used was that of classical composition. So in this painting by Vermeer would have spent over a year at least designing this painting so that these figures were somehow placed along this hidden system of lines. And that is classical composition. And the system of lines that he chose were designed to affect you in a particular way. And the system that he chose for this particular painting was a very delicate circle. So we're not meant to notice this straight away, but the positioning of the arm or the fabric on the ground are designed to give you this impression subconsciously. So we contrast this to the Rubens, which is very different in feeling.
Using the same technique, classical composition, Rubens had a much more aggressive theme, but he's using the same technique. So you can see sort of a more triangular shaped as composition. So he was such a master that he placed most of the male figures trampling the female figures in the bottom left. And what you find is that this is a hidden visual language that the artists were using. And just imagine transplanting sort of the more aggressive angular shapes onto this image, or using something more static and upright and tranquil. So the original meaning of the image would somehow be changed, and you wouldn't know why. Degas was a much more of a modern artist, but he was interested in photography. So he studied classical arts, but was interested more in shapes, sort of how the camera perceived reality. And what you find is it's just actually a continuity of what came before, because when the ballerina has been reduced to a circular shape and her minder to a triangle. So what we find is this language even sort of goes into sort of further into modern art, and Kandinsky, who said, I'm going to do away with representational art altogether and just communicate using these abstract shapes. So each shape has a particular emotional value that communicates to us. And these shapes actually sort of in a way originated from sort of over 2,300 years ago. So it was Plato sort of and the ancient Greeks who sort of thought that the Platonic solids were sort of symbolizing water, fluidity, earth, stability, and fire. So these are things that we can sort of feel, and they are a part of everything around us in our design. So imagine using sort of something more angular for the Disney logo, or sort of the Range Rover, which communicates sort of stability and maturity. It's sort of in an abstract way, these very, very basic shapes are communicating, so they're a part of everyday life. But the difficulty that we have with video games, sort of how can we use this, is that the player can look around an environment wherever they sort of within a 3D environment, but what we're trying to do is trying to translate these classical concepts from painting, static medium, to 3D environments. And what we find that it's not so difficult when we try to think what is the visual grammar that we're using, or what the classical artists used. And what they used were just curved lines, angular lines, and sort of the volumes and shapes that are sort of related to those. So where do we find these in video game environments? So in the character shapes, for example. So Mario is the example of the pure circular form. So he is very much related to the Vermeer painting, the first one that we saw, because everything about him is based on the circular concept. So his mustache, his spherical body, his cylindrical legs. And if you use a different shape to communicate Mario, then you sort of create something that feels very different. So in a way, sort of it's something that we maybe don't think about often, but Mario is used as a template to create Luigi and Wario. And all the artists have done really is sort of just sharpened or extended the shape vertically to create very, very different personalities. This extends to the environment as well. So circular Mario lives in a circular universe, and the trolls also sort of live in something more tooth-like and sharp. And so these are sort of the visual DNA. These are expressions of the visual DNA that each character represents. And this is something that we see all around us, again, in popular culture. So in The Lord of the Rings, everything from the Hobbit's curly hair, the rounded shoulders, the round hobbit holes, the curved landscape, is sort of in contrast to Mordor, where even the triangular volcano is sort of representative of this emotional contrast in terms of shapes. In video games, we can also think in terms of pathways. Sort of what does it feel like, what does it look like, or what does it actually feel like to drive around a curved bend versus a handbrake turn around the corner. So these are all sort of still very much linked to these classical paintings in terms of the visual language. Another thing is also character animation. So if you press the jump button in Journey, the character very gracefully sort of jumps across the screen, whereas in a game like Vanquish is a very aggressive zigzag through the environment. So again, we can sort of use this visual language to sort of understand what we're expressing with. What's really unique to video games is this artistic collaboration that historically, it was just the artists who got to feel the sensations of painting a curved line or an angular line on a screen. Whereas in video games, especially with motion controls, it's the player who can actually embody everything that is happening on screen physically. And so I think the strongest lesson that we can learn from classical art is shape sensitivity, because creativity is just the ability to make abstract connections. And if we study classical art, so we can sort of better see the relationships between very, very seemingly disparate artwork.